Thank you all for joining us today. This is the third in our series of webinars designed to support district teams in the process of identifying and selecting district-determined measures. My name is Ron Noble, and I am co-leading the Educator Evaluation Project for the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. With me to help facilitate today's session is Joe Jones from American Institutes for Research. Joe is a senior researcher at AIR and has over 16 years of experience in the assessment field. Those of you who joined us for part 2 of the series will remember hearing from Joe. So thanks again for joining us today, Joe.
Thanks, and hello, everyone.
Let's take care of a few logistics before we dive into the content for today. As always, we're going to do our best to answer your questions as we go. We'll also save some time at the end to answer any additional questions you might have. If you do have a question as we're going along today, please type it into the chat box in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. Please make sure you're directing your questions to all panelists from the drop-down menu. We'll have members of our team monitoring the questions. If you have a really specific question, what we'll do is just have one of our team members respond directly to you via the chat. If your question is more general in nature, we'll try to answer it on the audio feed so that everyone can benefit from the question. As far as recordings, each part of the webinar series is being recorded and archived on our webpage. The recordings should be available 7 to 10 days after the live session. I did receive emails from many folks looking for parts 1 and 2 over the last few weeks, and I am happy to inform everyone that we were able to figure out the YouTube channel here, and we have both of those webinars archived and posted on our DDM webinar webpage, which the link to the page is there for you. In addition, all the materials that you need to participate in today's session and the subsequent sessions will be right there as you click sign in. As you first sign in to join the session, you should see the documents that you'll need for the session. We also, at the request of many folks via the feedback survey after part 2, we also sent out the materials a bit earlier today via email. So you should have received an email if you registered prior to today from Kat Johnston with the materials, the slide deck and the 2 tools that we'll be debuting today. Just to take a minute to orient you to where we are in the series, we have the complete schedule here for you. As you can see, we're going to have a longer break between today's session and part 4 of the series. Part 4 is not going to take place until July 18th. Jump back. This break is to accommodate not only to accommodate the hectic schedules that face most educators at the beginning of the year, but also to give districts some time to work on the activities that we're going to introduce today. As you also see, we're still working out the logistics for the first technical assistance and networking session. I've mentioned these sessions on the previous sessions as well. The idea is to convene groups of educators on a regional basis and give them time to work on the content that's been provided in these webinars. Our educator evaluation team, which many of you know is a very small team here at the agency, is actually planning a major spring convening of educators in late May, and so as a result, we're pushing back the technical assistance sessions in order to accommodate that. So those sessions, the first round of sessions will take place sometime in June or early July, but in advance of that Part 4 July 18th webinar. What we'll do is we'll email anyone who's participated in any of the sessions with some detail about those sessions. We were really pleased after the last session to see that about 80% of the participants had found the session really helpful. And what we found sort of interesting was that the 20% who indicated some dissatisfaction represented a full spectrum of folks ranging from those who felt that we tried to cover too much content in the allotted time, all the way to the other end of the spectrum to folks who felt that the content was a little bit too simple given the audience. And what we have taken from that feedback is that districts are really approaching this work from very different starting points, which is something we were keenly aware of when we began the series, and we sort of knew that this would be our challenge. We really appreciate the feedback and your comments that you've given us, even those that are less than positive. We ask that when you complete the survey following today's session that you be really specific about the ways that we can better support districts, both those that are just beginning the process and those that already have fairly sophisticated assessment programs, in addition to the majority of you who are somewhere in between. We intend to be responsive to your needs, and these comments are going to help us figure out where we need to take this series and what other supports might be useful. One example of the way we're using the feedback is in part 2, participants indicated interest in learning about approaches they can explore specifically in traditionally non-tested grades and subjects, and as a result of that, we'll begin talking about this really important topic at the end of today's session, and we'll make time to revisit this idea in greater depth later on in the series. But again, just to remind who this series is for, it's really targeted at the district teams that will be engaged in the work of identifying and selecting district-determined measures. Specifically today, what we're going to accomplish is we're going to give you some details on the new DDM implementation timeline and how this will impact the work that districts are engaging in now. We'll also learn a bit about how a tool that we've created will allow districts to apply some of the concepts that you learned in part 2 of the series to conduct sort of an inventory of the district's current assessment. And lastly, you'll begin to understand how to match potential DDMs with your educators and conduct a gap analysis to help you hone in on where you need to do some more work around identifying potential DDMs. Here we have our agenda for the day. As always, the agenda slide will reappear to help you get a clear division of where we're heading as we move through the presentation. We're going to start just by briefly reminding everyone how the student impact rating is talked about in the regulations. So just as some quick reminders just to ground us today, for each educator, as many of you know, there must be at least 2 measures that are used to determine the educator's impact rating. There are options that are laid out in the regulations, which is cited here. They begin with statewide growth measures. These, of course, must be used where they're available. At least one must be used for each educator where available. The second pool of measures are the district-determined measures of student learning that we spend so much time in this series talking about. And then there's this additional piece in the regulations that talks about what we call indirect measures that might be more appropriate for educators whose primary role is outside of the classroom, so specifically some of our support personnel. Evaluators assign impact ratings based on both trends and patterns. When we speak about trends, we're always talking about at least 2 years' worth of data. When we're speaking about patterns, we're looking across at least 2 measures. The options for the actual student impact rating, there are 3 of them. They'll either be rated high, which indicates that you've had significantly more than 1 year's growth, moderate, which indicates 1 year's growth, and low, which indicates less than 1 year's growth, significantly lower than 1 year's growth. So those are the 3 values that ultimately the evaluator will select from in determining an educator's student impact rating. So as you saw on the previous slide, the student impact rating is a rating of an educator's impact on student growth. So it's important to understand why we focus on growth. Essentially, students come, and this is no news to educators out there, students come each year with a wide range of prior academic achievement, and therefore they begin their next year of instruction with varying levels of readiness to access the curriculum. This is obviously a situation that's beyond the control of the individual educator assigned to teach them. So measuring educators' effectiveness solely by the achievement level of their students really can't account for any of these prior conditions. By comparison, when you measure student growth, it's a way to help level the playing field. Improvement in student performance is a more meaningful and fair basis for determining the trends and patterns that we spoke about earlier that will ultimately yield the educator's rating on student impact. We do acknowledge, however, that growth measures are really just beginning to emerge in many content areas, and so for this reason, measures of achievement can serve as acceptable district-determined measures in limited circumstances when they are judged to be the most appropriate and or most feasible measure for that subset of educators. We're now going to just spend a few minutes talking about the revised implementation timeline for district-determined measures. So as many of you probably saw, the Commissioner sent out a memo on April 12th of this year that shifts the timeline, and this shift is really the direct result of feedback we heard from the field about needing a little bit more time to hone in on research and piloting of DDMs before entering the world of implementation. And so what the timeline looks like now is here before you. So next year, the next school year, is going to be a year for districts to pilot and identify district-determined measures. In other words, districts do not have to implement DDMs for any of their educators, but should be piloting and working on identifying DDMs where the district doesn't currently have things in place. That means that the 2014-2015 school year becomes the first year that districts are expected to implement district-determined measures for their educators. 2015-2016 becomes year 2 of data, and after that school year, the expectation is that districts will be assigning student impact ratings. Now, this is not to say that districts that are already positioned to accelerate the timeline shouldn't proceed as planned. In fact, they should. So districts that have already done the work of identifying district-determined measures in a subset of grades and subjects should by all means be encouraged to move ahead to implementation next year. The idea here is to provide relief to those districts that are a bit further behind in the work of identifying DDMs. With this shift in the timeline also comes new minimum piloting requirements. And so now, given that all districts have this next year to work on research and piloting, the Commissioner's Memorandum did identify 5 areas where the district must pilot at least one DDM. So here the 5 are for you. That's early grade K-3 literacy, so one DDM in one of those grades around literacy, one DDM in K-3 around math, one DDM in grades 5 to 8 on math, one DDM on high school writing to text, and then one DDM in a traditionally non-tested grade and subject. And there are a couple of examples there, although there are plenty of other subjects to choose from. If a district is unable to identify a district-determined measure in the grades and subjects that are listed here, the district must pilot one of our exemplar DDMs, which we expect to be able to release to you over the summer. So we're engaged in work now to prime ourselves to be able to have exemplar DDMs available for your perusal. So in the event that you don't identify one in those 5 areas, you will have the opportunity to select from our exemplars. We did get a question that came in regarding local negotiations that may have extended the definition of trends from 2 years to 3 years. So of course, if that's the case in your district, the expectation will be that the impact rating will be assigned to those educators after the 3rd year of data, if that's the way that the collective bargaining agreement reads. Another question, just to clarify the minimum piloting requirements here. It is, in fact, one DDM in any of the grades K-3 in literacy, for example. So you're not expected to pilot a DDM in each of those early grades, but you can select one DDM from any one of those grades. Hopefully that answers that question. There are reporting requirements that come with this revised implementation timeline that are slightly different from what's previously been published. I do want to take a minute just to talk through those. So in September 2013, what will be required from districts is potentially DDMs that the district will pilot and the grades and subjects that those DDMs are aligned to. This submission must address the minimum requirements. So those five minimum requirements have to be addressed in that submission. You'll also submit the grades and subjects for which the district has not yet identified potential DDMs and plans to research and or develop measures to pilot in the spring of 2014. That's going to be really crucial information for us at the state because that's going to help us identify where we need to do a little bit more work in helping to identify measures in the grades and subjects where districts are reporting to us that they haven't found anything acceptable. Then the final plan for actually rolling this out and implementing DDMs and being able to determine impact ratings will be due in February. So there is a bit of relief there, shifting that deadline out to February. So I just want to take a couple of minutes and just be quite candid. So we're not going to necessarily be able to provide answers to all the questions that you and the educators in your district are likely to have as we begin to undertake this work. Responses to many critical questions are going to evolve over the next several months and years even as districts and ESE jointly dig in and as research and results from other states engaged in similar work accumulates. We're going to hear from another expert from AIR a bit later about some approaches that other states are taking. As the Commissioner frequently says about this work, we expect this to be a developmental process. The idea is that we just can't afford to let perfect be the enemy of good. We have to remain focused on the goal of any quality assessment program, which is to benefit students and teachers alike. These assessments should improve student learning while obviously helping educators refine their instructional strategies by providing them with student-level data that they may not have had access to in the past. It's really going to be a new opportunity for many educators to benefit from more formalized sources of student data to inform their goal setting and lesson planning, which will ultimately lead to improved student outcomes. I think about my start in the classroom as a middle school math teacher in New York City. In my school of very few resources, as a math teacher, I still had access to multiple interim assessment programs, countless unit tests, and of course our state exam from which to plan from the data. My colleagues who taught social studies and the arts and physical education and even science always had far fewer assessments to choose from and as a result far less quantitative student data from which to build their lessons. The work, and that always seemed unfair to me, the work of identifying district-determined measures and the many other similar initiatives that are happening across the country are really going to help level the playing field across content areas so that all educators can benefit from having data from standardized tests, from more formal assessment structures. So that is sort of the vision here long term. We're going to now move and introduce to you a new tool that we're debuting today called the Assessment Quality Tracking Tool. We'll navigate to the tool in a moment. Essentially, the purpose of this tool is to help district teams understand how to apply some of the information that we shared in part 2 of the webinar series, Basics of Assessment. So ideally, district team members are going to work on this tool together as it'll help the team think about the aspects of an assessment that teams will consider as they identify potential DDMs to pilot or ultimately use. It's also going to provide districts a space to record information about potential DDMs in a real systemized and organized way. We do want to point out that this tool is designed to help you become more familiar with high-level criteria regarding assessments. So the results of going through this activity shouldn't be the sole basis for selecting or rejecting a potential district-determined measure, but are certainly going to help the district hone in on areas of strength and areas of growth with respect to each of your potential DDMs. So here you have, this is the information that the tool asks you to enter. And we'll actually navigate directly to the tool so you can see how it looks. It was available on the sign-in page. You should have also received it via email earlier today. If not, you can certainly email me, and I'll be happy to send you a copy if you weren't able to locate it. So we're going to navigate now to the tool so we can take a walk through. Bear with me a second, it always takes a minute to load. And there we are. So when you open the tool, you're going to see a cover page. The second tab is your instructions, much of the content that I just shared on the previous slide. And then the third tab at the bottom here is the actual tool itself. And so as you look at the tool, the idea is that each of your potential DDMs will be recorded on a separate row. So moving down vertically in column A, you'd enter the grade and subject aligned with the potential DDM, and then moving across, you've got the potential district determined measures name, the name of the assessment, and then you're going to enter some general information about the assessment. One feature of the tool that I want you to be aware of is you'll see many of the cells have red boxes, red triangles in the top right corner. For those of you who aren't familiar with this feature in Excel, this is just a way to have comments, to embed comments into the tool. So if you hover over the cell itself, you'll be able to have access to a little bit more information that will help you fill out complete the tool. So for example, when you hover over a potential DDM source, as I am now, you can see in the comment bubble that we're recommending appropriate responses such as developed within the district, commercial assessment, another district, not sure. So this is just some options, but obviously the independent circumstances of your district will dictate how you complete that entry, but that's just some options. As we move into things like assessment components, the information becomes a little bit more factual. So as you hover over a table of test specifications, you can get a little sense of a reminder of what we shared with you about the table of test specifications in part 2 of the webinar series, and then you'll have some instructions about how to actually complete this part of the entry for a particular DDM. So here you see there's actually drop-down menus embedded in to these cells where you can just simply select. As you move to the right, the next section you come to is alignment and rigor. Again, there's information here to help you figure out how to complete the tool. In general, when we talk about alignment, we're talking about that really important critical work that we mentioned in part 2 of the series about aligning a particular assessment to your district curriculum. So not only will you explain or will you use the drop-down menu here to indicate how well aligned the potential DDM currently is, but you'll also add some narrative here in the cell next door to share the process that the district went through. Again, this is not something that you'll be asked necessarily to submit to anyone or to share with anyone, but it is a way for the district team that's engaged in this work to begin to record exactly the steps they're taking to improve upon the assessments that they're thinking about or to evaluate. Joe, did you want to hop in here and have me hone in on any particular area as we go through?
Yeah, Ron, why don't we move on to the reliability section. Again, hello everyone, and you may remember me from the second webinar if you were able to attend that one. During that webinar, we talked about some additional aspects of the quality of a good assessment, things like reliability, validity, and non-bias. So there are some additional columns in this tool, in this tracking tool, that allows you to record some information about the different potential assessments regarding those particular aspects. So just as a reminder about maybe hover over that first one for reliability, Ron, where there's the red tab. So as a reminder of what reliability is from that second webinar, that's looking at the consistency of the assessment. So how consistent are the results that are coming out of the assessment? Going into this particular, if you go into the cell underneath the description, you can see what we're looking for you to add here isn't necessarily some form of a number regarding the reliability, but just what kind of evidence or what kind of approach was taken to collect evidence of reliability. Was it internal consistency, parallel forms? You may remember these different options from that webinar. And moving on to the next column regarding the evidence, in that column you would then enter for each kind of approach that you may have taken, what was done in that approach, and what were some of the findings that came out of that approach. Ron, if you want to go on to the next column, essentially we do the same thing for validity. So if you can recall from that second webinar, or if you weren't able to attend, Validity essentially has to do with how confident we can be about being able to say certain things, certain inferences, or certain assumptions about the assessment. So are those assumptions, are those inferences that we're making about the assessment valid, and how confident are we that they're valid? And there's different approaches to examining that. There's ways to look at the content of the assessment, ways to look at the relationships of the assessment with others. In the next column over, again, like reliability, you would just enter information about how you collected that. Moving on to the non-bias section, that's essentially what we're doing there is just asking for you to enter whether you did or did not gather evidence of non-bias. Not necessarily the approach that you took, but in the column after that, if you could provide any information you can about the evidence that was gathered about non-bias and how that was done. The last column in the spreadsheet here reflects some of the additional aspects of the quality of assessment that you would need to take a look at when determining which potential assessments you would want to use. So anything around maybe things that have to do with cost, the length of the assessment, technology needs, anything having to do with the feasibility of the assessment that maybe isn't captured through validity or reliability, but that's important for you to keep track of in determining whether you want to use that assessment as one of your DDMs.
Yeah, that last column is more or less a catch-all, and there's opportunity there to just record other notes like, for example, how familiar are your educators with this particular assessment? Is there going to be a steep learning curve figuring out how to administer it or how to score it, or is it something that was actually developed in-house by your educators? So there's buy-in there, there's familiarity. So those sorts of things will all be bucketed into this final column on feasibility.
That's right.
So
Ron, I didn't have anything else to add there. Go ahead.
Sure. We're really interested in hearing from our webinar participants about this tool and the next one that we'll get into in a moment, to hear how they work for you, whether you have suggestions for how we can improve them. The main point of this tool is just to give you space to start actually recording the conversations that we know are happening in many districts around their existing assessments, and to be able to give you opportunity or cues for you to follow up on some of the material that we presented in Part 2 in terms of evaluating assessment quality. So this is not a tool that you'll necessarily be able to sit down at your next meeting and complete a whole row for a given assessment because of the type of work that will go into, as Joe alluded to earlier as he was talking through those sections. There is some work that will need to be done to check on things like alignment to curriculum, alignment to rigor, reliability, validity, and evidence of non-bias. So you have a starting point here. You can fill out as much as you can based on the information that you have, and then you've got cues to then go off and identify or do the additional legwork that needs to be done in order to complete it. But do take an opportunity to share feedback with us as you explore and use the tool.
And Ron, I do want to point out one thing before we go on to the next tool, and I'll reiterate it after we've walked through the next tool as well, is that depending on where folks may be at with regard to identifying their potential DDMs, this tool versus the next tool, they may decide that it makes more sense to start with one of the tools versus the other. You may be farther along in the process, and it might make more sense to start with this particular tool because you may have a lot more of that information, whereas the next tool that we show you might be more of a source to sort of trigger thoughts around which DDMs they want to start gathering that information on.
It's a great point. It's related to a comment that we received from one of our participants who asked whether or not they would have to enter a separate line on the tool, a separate row, if the same assessment was going to be used in multiple grades, across multiple grades, or subjects. And the idea is to make this as simple for districts to use as possible. So if you're considering using a given assessment across multiple subjects or grades, by all means you can use that first column all the way to the left and just indicate all the different grades that you think might work for that DDM. That idea of matching DDMs to grades and specific subjects is actually the purpose of the next tool that we'll show you. So hopefully between the two, you'll have two good resources to help reconcile those questions. We also had a question about whether or not, if a district is piloting an assessment, they would need to complete the reliability and validity sections of the tool right away, or whether they could wait till the pilot results are available. And I think that's a great notion, and we fully expect that you may only be able to populate part of this tool for a given assessment initially, and you may very well want to conduct a small pilot next year and use some of that information to inform how you complete the rest of the tool.
Yeah, and I think we were considering this as an iterative process where some information may be filled out in one of the tools initially, and then as you'll see in the next tool, more information may be filled out in that tool, and then you may need to go back again to the assessment quality tracking tool to fill in some of that additional information, like reliability and validity, as you gather more of that information about the assessments.
So I'm going to turn control over to Joe for a moment so that he can take us through the second of the two tools we're introducing today.
Okay, thank you, Ron. So now let's take a look at the draft DDM Educator Alignment tool. The purpose of the draft DDM Educator Alignment tool is to provide the district teams with a draft tool that can be used when matching the potential DDMs to the various educators within the district. And once it's populated, it essentially supports, as Ron had mentioned at the beginning of the webinar today, what we're referring to as a gap analysis, where you're going to be able to identify where there are gaps in that alignment between the potential assessments and the educators and courses within your district. So it'll be able to give you a good snapshot of where there might be missing spaces in terms of the assessments or potential assessments you may want to be considering for different educators and courses. Again, want to just reiterate here that this is a draft document. It's not the final document, but one that's going to continue to be in evolution as you work through the process of identifying the DDMs. ESE really needs you to review and use the tool and provide feedback before it is finalized. So in a moment I will spend a little bit of time explaining how to use the draft tool, and then after your team has had some time to work with the tool, just please go ahead and send your feedback to ESE directly. So within the DDM Educator Alignment tool, again, it's an Excel workbook, and there are a number of worksheets within that workbook. There's, again, a cover page, a README section, some instructions. There's a worksheet on educators and courses, a DDM summary worksheet, a place to enter some information, additional information about DDMs, and then a worksheet where you're going to be able to look up certain courses if you don't have all that information readily available in order for you to fill out the educators and courses worksheet. So I'm going to go into more detail about each of these worksheets while I walk you through the workbook itself. So I'm going to go ahead and go into the workbook now. So again, here's just a cover page showing you that you are in the Educator Alignment tool. There is a README page that provides some additional information about the alignment tool, things like just an overview, the purpose of the workbook. Again, the purpose is to provide you a tool that helps you in identifying the educators and courses that may be evaluated by DDMs. And then just a brief description of each of the different tabs or worksheets within the tool. There's a worksheet here that does provide some additional instructions for each of the tabs. I'm not going to go through all the details here provided on this page, but I do want to just go over the overview again. What you're going to do here is provide information in the Educators and Courses worksheet and the DDM Descriptions worksheet. So that's where you're going to be actually entering in information. And your teams will then pull course information, if you need to, from the Course Lookup tab. So you won't be entering any information into that worksheet, but that's a place where you'll be able to pull information if you need to fill out the Educator and Courses worksheet. And then there will be some summary information that's provided automatically in the DDM Summary worksheet. So again, I'm not going to go through all the instructions here, but I'll go ahead and explain each of these tabs quickly to you as I go through each one of them. So this is really where you're going to be entering the majority of your information. So here you're going to be entering information about each educator. You would enter in information about the school. So I'm just going to make up some information here.
Joe, if you could take a second as well and just increase the size in the bottom right so that folks can see this a little bit easier.
Let's see if I can make that a little bit bigger. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. So again, I'm making information up here. Let's say you've got some educators at, let's call it Maybury School. I don't think that you have a Maybury School in your district, but if you do, that's a lucky guess on my part. You would enter in the MEPIT here, educator's last name, their first name, maybe their grade level, and then again you can go to, at this point you can go to the Course Lookup tab if you're not sure what the name and subject of the course is or the course ID. Let's say you go here and you can find information about the different courses. Let's just
stop here for a moment, Joe, just so everyone's clear on this tab.
Yeah.
These values here come from our SCS system. So districts submit each year a listing of all their courses, and they're aligned to subject, course, and course ID. It's highly likely that in your district you're using different subject, course, and course ID values. This is an example that if your district is using the ESC course IDs, then by all means go ahead and pull directly from this course lookup. But what you may end up doing in your district is replacing this tab with your local values, or your local subjects, courses, and course ID.
Okay, yeah, thanks for clarifying that, Ron. Yeah, that would make sense. So let's say you do want to pull the information from this tab. What you can do is you can copy, let's say you're picking a course here, Introduction to Agriculture. The course ID is listed as 18001, and you would actually, let's copy this piece. You don't need that course subject code, and then you can paste that back here, and that provides the information in here. If indeed you want to use that information from that tab, again, you may be able to enter in your own information. The course lookup is really there to provide you with guidance in case you're maybe not certain about which course name and which course ID to use. What you would then do is you would take a look at for each course and service, or each course and each educator, you would take a look and see what potential assessments you may be considering to enter in as a potential DDM. So in this case, then maybe you would enter in something here, such as test 1. I'll just make up a generic name. And it does take a minute for this to move on, but it's doing some calculations on the back end. Hopefully this won't take too long.
There's also an intermediary step as well that the districts should do. So after you complete columns A through H, so you've entered your educators and the courses that they teach, you may want to sort by course ID, and that's going to give you a quick snapshot of your highest incidence courses. It's also going to ensure that the same courses are lumped together so that when you're entering your potential DDMs, you'll be able to ensure that you list the same potential DDMs for all the educators teaching the same course.
Thanks, Ron. Yeah, I did skip that step. I apologize. But yeah, that you would want to do that in this case since there's only one. We'll only sort by one. But so I won't actually do the sorting. But yeah, you would take that step. Another thing that I did want to mention that is if you determine that the MCAS can serve as a DDM for that grade, school, or course, what you may want to do here or what you would want to do here is under the potential DDM1 is actually enter that MCAS assessment in as the potential DDM under that first column under potential DDM1. So if you do have an MCAS test assessment that you would be considering as a DDM or you would be using as a DDM, this is where you would enter it in here. Again, you would enter in any additional DDMs that you'd be considering for that particular course and for that particular educator in the next two columns. I'm going to skip past that tab for a minute, and what you would want to do under the DDM Descriptions tab is if there's any additional information, let's say for test 1, make this big again. I don't think you can see this very well. In this tab, you would just enter any additional detailed information about that DDM. So if you wanted to enter more information about what test 1 is, so test of agriculture, let's just say something generic like test of agricultural knowledge, you may want to add more detail than that, but this is an opportunity for you to just track additional information about those DDMs so that you have that on record somewhere. The final tab I want to just show you here would be the DDM Summary tab. And what you would do with this tab essentially is you would take a look at the information that's being provided in row 3 here. And what row 3 is doing is it's calculating from that Educators and Courses worksheet the total number of unique educators. So this is giving you information about the number of unique educators that you entered into the Educators and Courses tab, the total number of unique courses that are provided there, and then the total number of unique assessments that are coming up under your list of potential DDMs. And beneath those summaries, there's also information in each of these tables, which you'll need to refresh. Anytime you enter in any new information, you'll have to refresh these tables. Otherwise, it won't have the most updated information. But here it will provide you with a summary or account of all the courses and all the assessments that you've entered into the Educators and Courses tab.
And that's going to be really crucial information for districts to have access to, because you'll want to dedicate your resources to, at least initially, to the highest incidence courses and the highest incidence coverage that you'll get from a single assessment. And so if you complete this tool, you'll have a snapshot on this tab of the courses that are taught most frequently in your district, so that'll help you understand where you need to allocate some time to identifying assessments. But it'll also give you information about the number of courses that a single assessment, or the number of educators rather, that a single assessment will match up to. So if you're looking for an assessment that's going to give you the greatest coverage, you'll be able to look to this tab and quickly glean that information.
That's right. So this information is very useful in that it really does provide you with information to help you decide which potential assessments are really going to be the most likely to cover the most educators and courses, while keeping in mind that the goal is to have, again, 2 DDMs per educator. So it gives you a snapshot of being able to take a look at those numbers to see where you have the right coverage and where, again, looking to see where there might be gaps in coverage.
If we can hop back to the Educators and Courses tab just for a minute, Joe.
Sure.
Just to clarify, as you go through this, for educators that teach more than one course, that same educator will be listed on multiple rows. So one way to accomplish this could be for the district to send out the workbook to individual schools and have the schools populate this tab for all their educators, and then have the district sort of aggregate this. We fully recognize that this tool may be practical for our smaller and mid-sized districts, whereas some of our larger districts with many thousands of educators are very likely to have systems in place that will do much of this work for them. But we certainly have heard from many districts that that is not their reality, and so we're hoping that this tool will fill a gap for you.
Yeah, that's right. That's a good point, because you may be entering a number of times, if you are filling this out, you may be entering in, again, using Joseph Jones, myself as an example, you might be entering in that name a number of times on here. And what this summary worksheet will do is then calculate the number of instances of unique educators and courses. So if it is entered in, if Joseph Jones is entered in multiple times, or this particular course, Introduction to Agricultural and Natural Resources, is entered in a number of times. Actually, the course ID is what it calculates it based on. If that course ID is entered in a number of times, it will really only just, on this tab, show you the number of unique courses up here, and then it shows the actual count of each of those courses down in this tab. So if that Introduction to Agricultural and Natural Resources is entered in 15 times, it'll show that it was entered 15 times here, but it'll only show up as one unique course up on the top. Okay, Ron, did you have any other points you wanted to make about this tool, or any other comments you wanted to add?
No, I think we can transition back to the slides.
Okay, so at this point, I'd like to turn it back over to Ron to move on to the next section.
Thanks, Joe. So as we took a close look today at the work ahead in inventorying the district's potential DDMs and then aligning those assessments to specific educators, it seemed like an important time to spend a few minutes providing some insight into how other states and districts are approaching this work. We're really honored today to be joined by Marianne Lemke from AIR. Marianne is a managing researcher at AIR and serves as an expert for the federally funded Center for Great Teachers and Leaders on student growth topics. She leads AIR's value-added services work, which includes current projects in Florida, New York, and Texas, as well as other states and districts. So we're really happy to have Marianne join us for a few minutes today. And she's going to give us a little snapshot of how other states and districts are approaching this work. So I'm going to pass along control of the slides to Marianne, and she can take it from here. Marianne, you're going to have to push *7 to unmute yourself.
Well, great. Thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Perfect. Thanks, and I'm really pleased to be here, and glad I could participate. So I was asked just to provide a little bit of national perspective on what other folks are doing around this topic of non-tested grades and subjects, or really kind of going beyond measures that we have readily available in reading and mathematics. So in the case of Massachusetts, where you're looking for not just one measure, but additional measures. So how are other folks addressing that issue, and what are the types of solutions that are being implemented across the country? So there are a couple of different approaches that and I'm going to really focus at the state level now, that states are taking to this question, and there are kind of three big sets of them. One is that they are, where there are existing measures, they're making use of those and taking school-level versions of those and making those applicable to other educators. So as an example, if there's an existing reading measure based on the MCAS in Massachusetts, as you have, that at the school level might also be applied to a teacher in another subject if it were relevant to the type of content that teacher teaches. So that would be that's one approach. The second approach, which you are really taking here in Massachusetts, is to develop additional assessments or new assessments. This could involve a couple of different things, and I'll get into a little bit more detail. And the third thing is student learning objectives. Now, you already have a separate student learning goal component of your entire teacher evaluation system. So for Massachusetts, this is sort of less relevant in terms of an overall approach to this topic because it's already built into your system. So I thought I would just give a little more detail on each of these approaches, and then there are some, you'll see on the slides, there are some links as well if you're interested in additional information. Most of the states have websites where you can find additional information, examples, just a lot of really rich information about, again, what's going on sort of throughout the country. So the first approach that we talked about that I mentioned was school-wide growth. And what we mean when we say about when we talk about this is, as I said, sort of taking existing measures and applying them. This can take different forms. So sometimes there's some selection happening. So teachers may decide, for example, if you're a social studies teacher, that you would be measured using a school-wide measure in reading, for example. Or if you were a science teacher and there weren't an existing measure, maybe a math measure would be the most appropriate. So there are sort of different ways in which to think about that, but that's sort of the general approach. It doesn't necessarily need to only focus, however, on reading and mathematics. There are some states who are looking at sort of student learning objectives or subjects where if you build an assessment in a particular subject, that is a school-wide growth measure because there are only so many teachers who teach that subject, and therefore they sort of represent the school. So that's kind of another way to think about it. This could also be extended to non-academic areas. So there's no reason that as you're thinking of some of the indirect measures that Ron mentioned earlier, that school-wide measures of those sort, again, couldn't also be applied. And we're seeing that happening in several states as well. So that's one of the approaches. The second approach that folks are taking is really around developing new assessments, and this takes a couple of different forms. One way that states are approaching this is they're looking just to see what's commercially available. And so several states have run RFPs, put out requests to vendors to say, prove to me that your assessment is a good one that we could use for measuring growth for the purposes of educator evaluation. They've reviewed assessments that have been submitted and the evidence about them, and then they've sort of created these approved lists from which districts can then draw for particular grades and subjects. Now, this might only still get you, part of the way there, but it's one approach that some states have taken, and there's some examples here. New York and Ohio are a couple of states that have pursued this approach. Another version of this is to develop new statewide assessments. And some states are sort of approaching even this particular topic or this particular approach in different ways. One approach is to actually bring together lots and lots of educators within the state and have them develop assessments for the state. And this is something that Delaware did, literally brought together educators in all different subject areas and had big meetings, trained them, and had them sit together and develop assessments in sort of each and every area that the state was interested in covering as far as educators. That's one approach. Florida has taken a slightly different approach in that they've actually put out, again, an RFP to have assessments be developed in these areas, but working through their districts. So they're actually having district folks work with vendors in some cases or on their own to develop these assessments. So again, they're still using sort of the local capacity within districts, but again, sort of slightly different approach. And then the last thing that folks are doing really is providing guidance, the best available guidance that they can to districts to give them enough information to really sort of work on this locally. Again, really leaving this at the local level, and that's kind of the approach that Massachusetts is taking here with this series of webinars and so on, and some other states as well. That's really it. That's kind of the very brief overview of what's happening across the country. So you're in good company. There's a lot of work happening. And Ron,
Marian, thank you so much for that additional context. I think that's really helpful to our listeners. Coming down the pipe a little bit is some work that will maybe help Massachusetts push our way into some of those other categories that Marianne highlighted. We will be working to convene educators over the summer around different content areas to help identify anchor standards to which our exemplar DDMs will be tethered. And then again, we'll be relying heavily on our districts to help us ferret out some of those strong assessments that have been developed locally so that we can make them available to all districts. So there will be plenty of opportunity in Massachusetts as we move forward together in this work for us to hear from you and for us to make the work that you're doing locally available to others to benefit. Before we jump to opening up the floor for some questions, I just want to remind everyone to register for Part 4 of our series. In Part 4, we're going to be focused on the different approaches that districts might be considering, whether that means building, buying, or borrowing assessments. I also want to just highlight the other sort of unspoken option there in that building, buying, or borrowing. And maybe we didn't include it on the slide because it doesn't begin with B and it wouldn't have the flow, but we also will be talking about ways that districts can work together to collaborate to benefit from the way that each individual district is allocating its resources to this work, whether that's teams developing assessments in-house or refining existing assessments. So that collaboration piece will be discussed as well in Part 4. The registration link is there for you. Again, there is a break. The next one will not happen until July 18th. As always, if you have any questions about this work, please feel free to email me directly. I've been hearing frequently from many of you, and that's great. It helps us hone where to go next in terms of our approach and the support we're providing. So do feel free to reach out. I also want to remind everyone that the two tools that you previewed today are very much works in progress, and we do want your feedback. So please, as you're working on them in your district teams, if there are things that don't make sense to you or things that we could improve, don't hesitate to let us know so that we can make those adjustments. We're going to take any questions that folks have now, and on your way out, as you exit the WebEx environment, you will be prompted to complete a survey. The link to the survey is also here. That feedback is really important. We're only getting a fraction of our participants to complete the survey on their way out, and we do implore you to do so. So please take that time to do that. Any questions, please go ahead and enter them into the chat box now, and we'll be happy to answer them. We received one question about clarifying the purpose of each of the tools that we presented today. So the purpose for the first tool that you saw, the alignment tracking tool, the assessment tracking tool, is really to look at, to begin to give you space to inventory the assessments that you have in place that you're considering to use as potential DDMs, and to give you space to make notes about the quality of those assessments. Compared to the second tool, which is designed to help you align assessments that you've chosen or assessments you're considering to specific educators. Because what will happen as you map this out, for teachers that teach multiple subjects in particular, you may end up with a whole host, 6 to 8 to 12 potential DDMs that could be matched to that educator. So you need some systematic way to take a look across all the different courses that an individual educator teaches to select at least 2 DDMs for that educator.
And Ron, can I just add to that as well that, again, that the two tools can be used in an iterative process where you may enter some information into one of the tools and then go to the other tool, add some information, and then realize you wanted to go back and enter some or pull some information from the initial tool, so that they are intended to be used hand in hand.
That's right, and I can envision in some districts actually dropping the tracking tool right into the alignment tool as a tab, almost in lieu of the DDM description tab. I can see that being a potential solution in some districts. So please let us know if and how you're using them and what you find helpful and what you find lacking, and we'll be happy to make some adjustments. Any other questions from folks? We had a question come in regarding whether we were aware of any districts using student portfolios as DDMs. Portfolios are one of the types of assessments that the regulations allow districts to use as DDMs. We fully expect that many districts will choose to go that route, particularly in traditionally non-tested grades and subjects. I can't say that I have specifically been informed by any districts that is their intention. But I have had conversations with, in particular, the vocational technical community, and I do have a sense that portfolios may play a role in the way that they solve the DDM initiative. We also had a question come in about whether the model curriculum units that our agency has published will have DDMs. So the model curriculum units do include curriculum embedded performance assessments. One of the challenges in terms of how that reconciles with the DDM initiative is that the units are very frequently short in length, and so the challenge there is whether or not there's enough time that goes by to make it an acceptable district determined measure for an educator over a full year, if you're looking at, in particular, a 2-week unit. So I have heard some districts thinking about stringing together several unit tests and figuring out a way to make several unit tests translate into a single growth measure. So that's interesting work to engage in, and we'll be very receptive to hearing districts' experience with that type of approach. We also received a question about the activities that participants will need to complete before the next session. So the idea is that the two tools that we introduced today will be the topics of the first technical assistance and networking session. So when we have that opportunity for all of you to come together, you will be able to work together on those tools, compare notes on how you're using them, share feedback with us directly on ways that we might be able to improve them. So the two tools are essentially what will allow you to conduct that gap analysis and really dig into your current assessment portfolio to see where you need to direct your resources moving forward. So that'll be the work that you should be engaged in before the next session, Part 4. We received another question about whether or not we need to submit the DDM Educator Alignment Tool in September. This is certainly something that's occurred to us as well. As we're trying to make this as simple as possible in terms of the reporting requirements, one idea that we have been thinking a lot about is if we can publish a tool that's very easy to use and that districts like, that can help them with planning, but then when it's time for reporting, can also just be turned back to us, that would be ideal. So it's not as though you're exerting a lot of energy and effort to simply create the report that you'll end up submitting to ESE, but in fact, that tool will help you along the way. So that is definitely something we're thinking about, and we're hoping that the DDM Educator Alignment Tool will evolve into an easy enough and effective tool that could serve as the submission in September. Patrick asked about whether or not the tools can be pre-populated with SCS data. It's a great notion, Patrick, and I thought of the same. We are in talks with our data unit to see to the extent that they can be pre-populated. One of the challenges that we are facing now is that the last submission was in October, and so the data is already quite out of date. And the other challenge is that with respect to DDMs, you're always forward-looking, looking at the courses that the educator will be teaching next year as you're working to match the educator with DDM. So there'll always be a challenge there as the SCS data won't match up perfectly necessarily with what'll be taught in the next year. But we have talked to our data group to see if it's possible to have pre-populated worksheets deposited into each district Dropbox, and that is possible. So we're gonna explore that over the summer as the next SES data is collected. So thank you all so much for your time and attention today. We really appreciate that you all were able to join us today. We hope that this was helpful. We're really excited to hear feedback on the tools. We do hope that they are going to serve districts well. Any questions, concerns, comments, feel free to email me directly, and do again complete the exit survey on your way out. And we will see you all at the TA sessions, and then again on July 18th for Part 4. Thanks a lot.